Welcome to your second sample question on the topic of lonely family members. So in the previous question with the arrow, we saw that remembering those very base requirements of family sponsorship can play a role in you choosing the correct answer. Now in this question here, we're going to look at some of those other elements that the sponsor needs to meet in order to qualify to sponsor a family member as a lonely family member. So this is the scenario of Samantha. Now Samantha is a Colombian who's been living in Winnipeg for the past 5 years. She obtained her Canadian citizenship last year and tells you that she's been ostracized from the majority of her family in Colombia because she's been living with her same-sex partner, Tamara, for the past 3 years in an apartment they purchased together. The reason that Samantha contacts you is because she has a 16-year-old cousin, Mateo, who would love to join her in Canada once he finishes high school if his parents accept. As both of Samantha's parents and both sets of grandparents have passed away, she would like to explore sponsoring Mateo under the family class. Assuming she meets the financial and contractual requirements, what would you advise Samantha? A. She is eligible to sponsor Mateo as a family member. B. She is not eligible to sponsor Mateo as a family member. C. At this moment, it would be a better idea for Mateo to immigrate under one of the economic streams. D. She is not eligible to sponsor Mateo since she can sponsor his parents instead. Okay, so hopefully you have an idea of a couple of the answers that you're going to explore that might be correct, and hopefully you have an idea of a couple of the potential answers that you know are incorrect. So if you want to press pause right now, that would be a good idea, and we'll continue on after you've figured out the answer. Now, when we looked at that story, some of these elements are pretty important. So we have Samantha's status in Canada, and we have basically what she's doing in Canada as well. So her living arrangements and her relationship arrangements. Then we get to the part about her family. So we talk about the cousin, and then we have those people that she could potentially sponsor. So when you're thinking of the lonely family member, remember that the person in Canada has to not be able to sponsor anybody else. And you can see over here that she likely meets that because her parents have passed away and both grandparents. There's nobody really left to sponsor. Now when we take a look back at the question itself and those potential answers, we start to really dig into the process that you're going to go through on exam day, but with 100 questions. Alright, so the question itself is assuming she meets the financial and contractual requirements, what would you advise Samantha? Now, with the question here, when they say financial requirements, you should automatically be thinking of the LICO. And contractual, you should be thinking of the undertaking and the agreement that she would sign with the family member. So let's begin with C. Now C says at this moment it would be a better idea for Mateo to immigrate under one of the economic streams. And if you worked your way through those economic stream lessons, you probably have a good little bit of knowledge about all of those programs, and of course whether or not Mateo would qualify for them. So with Mateo, we could see that he is 16 years old and he hasn't finished high school. Now, when you look at those economic programs, a lot of them don't overtly say that a person under 18 can't apply for it, but it's almost impossible to meet any of the experience requirements and education requirements if a person's under 18. So for those reasons, we know that C is incorrect. So let's jump ahead and take a look at A. Now A gives us a lot of information to explore as it relates to the other options presented to us. So A says she is eligible to sponsor Mateo as a family member. So let's explore this one here, because this gives us a really great lesson on sponsors' current or future relationships in Canada as they relate to that sponsor being able to or not being able to sponsor someone else as a family member. Now remember that a sponsor cannot, in terms of sponsoring someone under the lonely family member, as a lonely family member, that sponsor cannot have a Canadian or permanent resident son or daughter, which, as we saw, Samantha doesn't have. They can't sponsor parents or grandparents. So Samantha doesn't have a Canadian parent and doesn't have any Canadian grandparents. Okay, she doesn't have any Canadian brothers or sisters. There's no mention of anything like that. There's no mention of uncles or aunts either. There is no mention of Canadian nephews or nieces. But when you get to the last one here, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So she's been living with her same-sex partner, Tamara, for the past 3 years in an apartment they purchased together. So with this one here, this would be very similar to a common law relationship. Now in the example, they didn't say overtly that they're in a common law relationship. But when you take a look at the lesson later on spouses and common law relationships, you'll see that one of the big indicators of it is that they've been together for 3 years and they purchased an apartment together. When you're looking at the difference between, we'll talk about this in detail, of course, in the lesson on spouses and common law partners and conjugal partners, of course. But one of the biggest indicators of that, and separating or knowing the difference between a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship and a common law partner relationship, is that a common law partnership is basically a marriage without the wedding day. And you can see that a couple who's been living together for 3 years and purchased an apartment together is seemingly in a marriage-like relationship. So because Samantha has a common law partner in Canada who's Canadian, that would make her ineligible to sponsor Mateo. But what we're going to do, of course, is take a look at the other two options. So we have to take a look over here to see if Samantha can sponsor Mateo's parents. So if Samantha can sponsor her uncle or aunt. Now, by knowing that she has a Canadian partner, we know that this is not possible either. So she can't sponsor her uncle or aunt. And finally, let's take a look at B now. So with B, we have she is not eligible to sponsor Mateo as a family member. So this is what we saw when we analyzed the other options. Now remember, she has a common law partner who is Canadian. So with this, that makes her ineligible to sponsor Mateo. And by unlocking that concept of the lonely family member, it really helped you to analyze and know out of the three options which one was correct. Okay, so we see that B is the correct answer. Now, this was a great lesson on understanding how important it is to know the sponsor's requirements with regard to the lonely family member. In the lonely family member, it's a very concise, very straightforward area of immigration, and especially if you understand the sponsor himself or herself and the requirements that person needs to meet in terms of being able to sponsor someone under this particular program. Now, if you got this one correct, a very big congratulations again. You have taken one more step closer to being able to completely master the lonely family member area of family immigration. All right, so you have one more question coming up. It's going to test you on a different area of the lonely family member program, and hopefully you get that one correct as well. All right, so thank you for listening and working hard in studying for your full skills exam, and I'll talk to you when you take a look at the next question.